Tokyo, Japan is among the most modern cities in the world. But in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, it was a city in ruins, and groups of people roamed the streets in search of food. 40 years later, the city and the country of Japan are virtually unrecognizable. Industries which had been destroyed by the ravages of war have recovered, and new industries are being born. Its rapid rise to prosperity is called simply the Japanese economic miracle.
Hello, I'm Robert Christopher, and I'd like to welcome you to Anatomy of Japan, the wellsprings of economic power. When Japan lay in ruins at the end of the Second World War, not even the experts foresaw its swift recovery and rise to economic power. Reconstruction began under the rule of General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the Allied occupation forces, and by the 1960s, the Japanese economy was booming. In the 1970s, Japan survived 2 world oil crises and continued to prosper despite mounting trade frictions. Today, Japan's per capita income is among the highest in the world. In this program, we'll trace the remarkable history of Japan's post-war economic growth. It's a story that begins one August day in 1945 on the deck of a U.S. battleship in Tokyo Bay.
The battleship Missouri, 53,000-ton flagship of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, becomes the scene of an unforgettable ceremony marking the complete and formal surrender of Japan.
To sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
Mr. Shigemitsu comes to the surrender table. These dramatic first pictures were made by newsreel war correspondents and Army and Navy cameramen and were specially flown back from Tokyo.
On board the battleship Missouri, Tokyo Bay, August 1945, Japan's post-war economy began anew, from almost nothing.
General MacArthur, commander of the Allied forces, arrives on the transport plane Bataan on August 30th.
General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, would rule Japan for 6 years as the supreme commander of the Allied powers' occupation forces. The goals of the occupation forces were democratization of Japanese society and the demilitarization of the Japanese economy. The occupation forces were almost entirely American. The Japanese people expected atrocities and reprisals. What they received was a brisk and efficient administration which affected all aspects of national life. In pre-war Japan, there were very few private automobiles. The jeeps driven by the American soldiers came to symbolize a world beyond Japan, one of greater technological skill and a higher standard of living. Japanese industry lay in ruins. National steel production in 1946 dropped to 1/10 of pre-war levels. With factories destroyed and a severe shortage of skilled labor and resources, Japan's economy lay on the verge of collapse.
Is there anything to eat? On every street corner, there are growing numbers of people who spend all day walking about in search of food. If they succeed in finding any on the black market, it's costly. 2 small balls of rice will cost them 5 yen, as will some slices of dried potato, and the price of a bread roll is 7 yen. With the lack of food supplies and delivery problems continuing in large cities across the nation, people who cannot buy food or obtain it on the black market are somehow living from day to day by eating weeds. There has been a conspicuous increase in all major cities of malnutrition. This child suffers from so-called war dropsy, severe swelling of parts of the body. Hoping to appeal directly to His Majesty to take appropriate measures, a large group of citizens gathered at the Sakeshita Gate of the Imperial Palace. They pressed for a hearing with the Imperial Household Agency for their representative who carried a petition. The crowd pushed aside the guards and advanced steadily into the palace grounds. In the end, the government avoided taking action, and the emperor himself responded to the starving citizens.
ただいまより食料事情に関する天皇陛下のお言葉でございます。
The first step in rebuilding our country must be to create stable, secure lives for our citizens. The problem of food supply in our cities is now graver than ever before, and we are deeply pained by this situation.
This film was produced by the Occupation Forces Information and Education Bureau. The film was part of a widespread effort to build a post-war Japan which included women's voting rights, economic decentralization, and land reform. The message was clear. To the Japanese, America seemed a promised land where freedom and democracy reigned, and life was harmonious and full. In elementary schools, playgrounds, and shrine or temple courtyards all over Japan, some 40 million people gathered to watch the flickering promise of a better life ahead.
私たちも桑で起こす以外にない牛口ですか。あれで起こす以外ない。
In those days, we still had nothing but hose to turn the soil over. I think the Americans were already doing it with a machine they rode on. There was a revolving part that shook the wheat, as I remember it. I was quite young then, but even so, I understood that as farmers, we were technologically weak, like bamboo, against the atom bomb.
The way things were done here, even if we wanted to grow cabbages, say, we couldn't if somebody told us to grow barley. But in America, they'd talk it over and they'd say, okay, let's grow cabbages, and they could grow cabbages. In Japan, if we were under orders, we couldn't grow what we wanted to. That was the big difference. That kind of thing was taken for granted in American farming villages, and that's really democracy.
On October 8th, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and other giant zaibatsu, which have been an integral part of Japan's political and economic structure for more than 70 years since the Meiji Restoration, took the first steps toward dissolution. From the time of Japan's entry into the Pacific War, these groups monopolized heavy industries such as aircraft, shipbuilding, and mining under their corporate umbrellas. They became a driving force in the war against America and Britain and took advantage of conscripted labor to realize huge profits. The committee established to handle the dissolution under the direction of General MacArthur's staff began a major investigation of the stock certificates on October 2nd. At 10 o'clock on the morning of October 8th at the main offices of Mitsui and Mitsubishi, the proof of these profits, stock certificates, were packed into wooden boxes and trucked off to the industrial bank guarded by American military and Japanese police. Political rights for women, long called for by far-sighted people, have at last become a reality, along with other freedoms that have accompanied the end of the war.
Political rights for women have been gained at the very great price of war, so we must cherish them. If we use these rights well, the food distribution system will improve, and the position of women will surely rise.
The new constitution for Japan replaces the Meiji Constitution and declares that sovereign power resides in the people. His Majesty the Emperor makes an appearance at the House of Peers inauguration ceremony and reads an imperial address.
Today, we promulgate the Constitution of Japan. We shall join with the people in giving our fullest efforts to carry out the terms of this Constitution correctly, to respect moderation and responsibility, and to build a cultural state loving freedom and peace.
On May 3rd, 1947, the Imperial Meiji Constitution ends a 58-year history. And the new democratic constitution takes its place.
The emperor, once a godlike figure to the Japanese, declared his human status. He toured the country, making personal appearances at mines and factories. In the first decade after the war, Japan's economy grew at an annual rate of 10%. Coal and steel production climbed, helped by heavy subsidies from the National Bank of Reconstruction.
The coal industry is very important to Japan, so it is my hope that you will make your very best efforts.
Once again, this factory is filled with the sound of machinery running as workers rush to send out much-wanted light bulbs to the dark cities and towns. Responding to the call to quickly build many new houses in areas burned down during the war, the Hirano factory in Osaka has speedily switched from building airplane parts to manufacturing an essential element for construction, nails. We have heard the hopeful news that it's possible to build a self-powered bicycle in just 30 minutes. They say it does take some pedaling to get up hills, but not enough to tire the rider. With a half-horsepower engine, it can achieve a speed of up to 30 kilometers per hour.
In 1946, Soichiro Honda hung the sign Honda Technical Research Institute in his hometown of Hamamatsu. Honda employed just 12 workers and began building engines to motorize Japan's many bicycles.
It started when my wife told me that going out on her bicycle to buy rice really tired her out. In those days, you could get little 50cc engines that the Army used to generate power to run communications equipment. I thought, if I could attach one of those to the bicycle, it would be easier for my wife. So I got one and put it on. It made a real putt-putt sound, but it also made the shopping a lot easier. Then other people saw it, so I began to get orders.
The Tokyo communications industry was another new company, now called Sony. Akio Morita was one of the founders of the company and is now chairman and chief executive officer of the Sony Corporation. In 1948, the company prospectus called for creating an ideal factory where technicians can put their abilities to use freely and openly, and to begin using the new technologies for people's everyday lives. In just 40 years, Sony grew from a little factory in one corner of a bombed-out department store to a global enterprise with 86 plants in Japan and another 44 branches in 25 countries around the world.
At first, we lived from day to day, just eager to get some work. We couldn't think about what the future would be like. Looking back now, I believe that you can judge the strength of a company's foundation by how far the management is able to look. We started out thinking about the next day, then the next week, then the next month, and finally the next 5 years. But to be honest, in those days, we were worried about tomorrow. We didn't have great hopes.
In June 1950, war broke out on the Korean Peninsula. The forces deployed to the Korean front needed arms and equipment. In order to fulfill the logistical needs of the Army, the United States began to procure supplies from Japan, providing a powerful stimulant to recovery.
This giant underground factory carved out of the mountainside in Kanagawa Prefecture is a former Army munitions factory that has been sold to private enterprise. Today, riding on the wave of special procurements, it has returned to manufacturing weapons such as aircraft flare bombs. In Osaka, meanwhile, such weapons as trench mortar shells and fire bombs are being produced in large volume, and the industry is exhibiting unusual activity. The bond markets have gone wild in both eastern and western Japan, spurred by the special procurements rush. Markets were forced to close down when round-the-clock trading created chaos.
In the first year of the Korean conflict, America's special procurements provided 1/4 of Japan's total overseas earnings. Production in mining and manufacturing soon surpassed pre-war levels. By 1955, Japan's economy had moved from a stage of post-war recovery to one of rapid industrial growth.
Charged with the important mission of conducting peace treaty talks with Japan, a special American delegation headed by John Foster Dulles arrives at Haneda Airport and is received by General MacArthur.
The war in Korea had helped focus American thinking. A strong and independent Japan could form a bulwark of democracy in the Pacific. But the terms of the treaty sparked controversy in Japan's national parliament.
The 10th National Diet was convened and focused on the peace treaty issue.
If we have lost all will to defend ourselves by ourselves, then our independence as a nation is absolutely inconceivable.
We are opposed to the rearmament of Japan. We believe that this is the only reasonable stance to prevent entry into war and at the same time contribute to the peace of Asia and the world.
The security of our country must, of course, be maintained and nurtured by the strength of our own people. However, I cannot pass over with simple arguments the idea that this should automatically lead to rearmament.
The conference on the peace treaty with Japan takes place at the San Francisco Opera House, September 4th, 1951, with 52 nations participating. Held at a time when tensions are heightening between East and West, the conference opens with a speech by President Truman and ends with 49 nations signing the treaty. This signals the world's reacceptance of Japan as a member of international society.
At the same time Japan signed the peace treaty, it also signed the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. Japan took the route of revitalizing its national economy within the framework of the security system. By the late 1950s, the first signs of Japanese prosperity began to appear. In 1951, restrictions on consumer goods were finally lifted. The Japanese people finally began to enjoy the fruits of economic recovery. Japanese business leaders from the steel, auto, and other heavy industries began to tour America in order to learn U.S. production techniques and management systems. A technological revolution was beginning in the United States, and Japan did not want to be left behind. The idea of quality control, popularized by the American W. Edwards Deming, held particular appeal for the quality-conscious Japanese. After the war, Japan's exports to the West consisted mostly of light industrial goods, hats, sandals, brooms, and other labor-intensive products. Bicycles and sewing machines were among the few relatively sophisticated products coming out of Japan. But Japanese companies soon began looking to America, trying to establish a foothold in the world's largest marketplace. Mr. Yoshimi Takemoto first came to New York in 1957, representing an electrical appliance manufacturer. It took him 4 years to open his firm's first American office, here on the 80th floor of the Empire State Building.
I often used to make paper airplanes and launch them from here and watch to see where they landed. Makes me nostalgic to think of that. When I left Japan, there were limits on the amount of currency you could take out, so I had to economize on my food. I remember buying a hot dog at one of those stands down on the subway, and that was my breakfast and lunch. It was really tough.
Mr. Takemoto's first product for the American market was a bicycle light with its own internal generator. In Japan, it was his company's strongest product, an essential item for every Japanese who commuted home from work through the darkened city streets. It seemed a natural item for export, small and light, easy to ship, and relatively sturdy.
The generator lamps didn't sell as well as we expected. The reason was that although there were millions of bicycles in America, people almost never rode them at night. It was hard to understand that kind of thing if you were in Japan, but when you came here, it was obvious. Lots of cars, a completely different society from Japan then. So that's why we couldn't sell as many of the lamps as we'd calculated.
The next product Mr. Takemoto introduced did better. It was a transistor radio, a brand new consumer item designed for an increasingly mobile society. Takemoto didn't think the radio would sell under a Japanese brand name. He contracted with an American to help market the product, who has carefully stored that very first radio for all these years.
Here's our old...
Oh, yes. That was the number one.
Number one.
You sold 1 million units. Over a million units, yeah. Gee.
Mr. T.E. Weed designed that one himself.
Under the American brand name, Channel Master, the two men marketed more than 1 million portable transistor radios. On the back, the words "Made in Japan" are barely visible. Japanese manufacturers began turning out transistor radios with a vengeance. The success of pioneers like Mr. Takamoto helped pave the way for later Japanese electronics makers who would come to dominate the American home entertainment market.
Sometimes foreigners say to me that it's just shameful the way they invented new technology and then Japan develops it into a product and sells it back to them. I always answer this way. Of course, the original technology is important, but it is not enough for doing business. What are you going to make with the technology? That's the first thing. I made radios with transistors. After that, you have to let customers know what a handy thing you've made, or they won't buy it. The first time I made a small radio and took it around, everyone said, "The trend now is toward big hi-fis. Who would buy a little radio like that?" But I disagreed. They would be starting many new radio stations, I pointed out, and each person would want his own radio. So small ones would be handy. Small radios, small TVs, small videos. Every time we developed a product, we had to educate the customers and create the market. So you can't succeed in making a business out of new technology without first designing a product, second, educating the consumer, and third, creating a market. We need creativity in all three of these areas, or we cannot succeed.
Between 1955 and 1959, heavy industry benefited from massive private investment. The Japanese economy was growing at an annual rate of 7.5%. The Ministry for International Trade and Industry, or MITI, began to move its emphasis from steel production and shipbuilding to plastics, petrochemicals, autos, and electronics. In the meantime, the Japanese people began to enjoy some of the new fads brought by economic recovery.
Mambo dance and mambo pants are spreading like wildfire as many have been struck with mambo mania. Young people are fond of the trousers, which look like old-fashioned Japanese long johns and are called rickshaw man style. Young men and women are flocking to dance palaces in search of the passionate rhythms.
He is sincere and upstanding, a person whom I deeply trust and respect. That is what I found attractive.
In 1959, the Crown Prince married a commoner, the lovely Michiko. Democracy had indeed even spread to the imperial household. Two developments dominated Japan's political scene in the early 1960s. One was a fierce protest movement against the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty. The forceful stance and tactics adopted by the government of Prime Minister Kishi prompted a strong reaction from the people. The National Diet, the nation's capital building in Tokyo, was surrounded by demonstrators against the treaty, and clashes between police and protesters were a daily occurrence. The second conflict grew out of Japan's changing energy demands. Oil consumption overtook coal consumption in 1960. The coal industry had provided the backbone of the Japanese recovery during the immediate post-war years. As the demand for coal declined, managers instituted rationalization measures, which sparked bloody confrontations with the miners. In 1960, the government of Prime Minister Ikeda introduced a plan to double national income by 1970. A high-growth program was launched.
The results for the past year are ahead of our calculations. For this, I apologize. But however much I apologize, it may be justified. Because the Japanese economy is expanding rapidly, I have adopted measures to normalize that expansion. And I want to say clearly that I believe that the basic income doubling plan was correct and is correct and sets the correct course for the future.
To achieve Prime Minister Ikeda's ambitious goals, Young men and women from the country were recruited right out of high school to come work in the new factories and mills. Many came from rural towns and villages where their families had tilled the same land for generation after generation. The new factories were being built in major cities across Japan, sometimes hundreds of miles from their hometowns. At the train stations, students were met by representatives of the companies that had hired them. It was the beginning of the urbanization of Japan. The city of Kawasaki became one industrial center. Between 1955 and 1965, the population doubled to 800,000. The young people who came from the country provided a pool of cheap and conscientious labor for Japan's emerging companies. Takahashi was one such young worker.
To put it bluntly, I wanted my mother to have one less mouth to feed. She always worked so hard. So I chose to go to work instead of continuing with school. And that's how I did my growing up.
At the time, petrochemicals was one of the most important industries with a good future. So as I remember, I was proud to enter the company.
By 1962, the population of Tokyo exceeded 10 million. As people continued to stream into the metropolis, housing became a serious problem. Japanese felt lucky if they could move into one of the new concrete apartment complexes called danchi that were being built throughout the city.
The Sato family has been happily bathing together in their tub in the danchi. Little Hiro, however, can't quite understand that this is the family's own bathtub. Her father explains that it's her bathtub in her house, but she just replies, "Isn't it nice to live so near the public bath?"
In the early 1960s, the average salary of a Japanese company worker was 564,000 yen per year. This was only about one-third the average salary in the United States. While the quality of life in Japan was improving, there remained a considerable gap between life in Japan and life in America. In the United States, there was one car for every 3 Americans. In contrast, there was only one car for every 78 persons in Japan. But the era of Japanese consumerism was about to begin.
In those days, we used to wring clothes after washing with a hand-operated roller. It was a lot of work, but it was much easier than using a washboard. Once I got a washing machine, I'd wash clothes that we'd hardly even worn.
Beginning with the washing machine she purchased in 1959, this homemaker bought 2 new appliances every following year, one more every time her husband brings home his bonus check. In 1960, she bought a black and white television set, an electric kettle, a stereo, a video player, a juicer, and a radio cassette recorder. She now has a house full of appliances, but is still saving her money for an air conditioner. In Japan, the television, refrigerator, and washing machine are regarded as the 3 sacred treasures of modern life. Researchers track the introduction of these 3 appliances in this 24-unit apartment building. The first purchase was a television in 1956. Then came washing machines. The number of television sets increased dramatically with the Crown Prince's wedding in 1959, by which time 90% of the households claimed to include all of the three sacred treasures. Life was gradually getting more luxurious for the Japanese. Hayato Ikeda was known as the low-profile prime minister. He avoided political confrontation and skillfully directed Japan's energies toward achieving his goal of doubling the national income. Ikeda's private brain trust for economic affairs was called the Thursday Club. The central figure was the economist Osamu Shimomura, an alumnus of the finance ministry. Shimomura divided the economy into 80 different categories and projected how the economic growth desired by the prime minister could be obtained.
Mr. Ikeda was very good at reading charts and graphs, and he enjoyed working with numbers. It was almost a hobby for him. It was clear he was quite confident. He felt able to handle any criticism because we had already thought it through here. This confidence was also evident when he debated the issue in the Diet.
The city of Tokyo was growing at an enormous pace, but the roadways and infrastructure remained holdovers from the pre-war period. In preparation for the Tokyo Olympics in 1964, 250 billion yen were spent to improve transportation in Tokyo. And the long dreamed of Shinkansen, or bullet train, racing here even faster than in real life, made its first appearance. The 1964 Tokyo Olympics were the first to be held in Asia. Japan had been scheduled to host the International Games in 1940, but they were canceled when war broke out. To be chosen once again to host the Olympic Games, just 19 years after the war's end, was seen by many as a symbol of Japan's reemergence on the international scene. The year 1967 saw the population of Japan top 100 million. In the mid-1960s, Japan gradually began to lift foreign exchange restrictions, reduce import barriers, and liberalize regulations governing capital investment. International competitiveness improved, and the country began to maintain a favorable international balance of payments. By 1968, advances in the steel, shipbuilding, and automobile industries had made Japan the second largest economy in the world, surpassing West Germany. Japanese consumers were invited to participate in the new economic prosperity.
Everyone assemble. Greetings to the chairman.
Everything is a matter of winning or losing, and these are turbulent times. We live in an age of war, with extremes of prosperity or poverty, profit or loss. However tired you may be, do not drag your feet. You must always move forward at a brisk pace. Just because you feel fatigue, you must never stand idle.
The prototypical Japanese company man was being forged, shaped by economic competition. Tokyo was now alive 24 hours a day, bursting with economic activity.
There's been this rapid growth since the war, but in fact, I think we really worked hard, and I think we all feel that way, right?
We had it tough when we were young, but we got through it. So no matter how tough things get in the future, I know I'll be able to get through it. Other people too.
Yeah, that's right.
By the mid-1960s, one consequence of Japan's industrial expansion was becoming clear. Air, water, and noise pollution emerged as serious social and environmental issues. The Bay of Tago, at the foot of Mount Fuji, was filled with millions of tons of sludge, the waste products of the many paper mills which rimmed its shore. The bay was slowly dying, filled with deformed fish, their back and tail fins all but dissolved from industrial pollution. Cadmium poisoning attacks the calcium in the bones. Victims suffer excruciating pain, eventually weakening and dying. More than 130 Japanese died of the disease, the world's first human victims of cadmium poisoning. The Japanese took to the streets, calling for stricter environmental laws. One of the most wretched consequences of water pollution was Minamata disease, named for a coastal town. Many residents died, poisoned by the mercury dumped into their harbor. A total of 903 Japanese died of environmental poisoning. A second consequence of Japan's rapid industrialization was the depopulation of Japan's countryside. Across Japan, more than 1 million people, mostly men, began leaving their families for several months out of the year to work in the cities. Soon, entire families were moving to Japan's urban centers. 2/3 came from Tohoku, in northeastern Japan. This annual migration, called dekasegi, is now accepted as a fact of life there. In 1969, the average farming family in Tohoku earned 60% of its annual income from sources other than agriculture. Most laborers from rural areas found work in construction, building the roads, subways, and skyscrapers of modern Japan.
大体よ、金が取れねえとこにもよ、テレビでも自動車でも何でもよ、100万兆じゃ億万兆じゃと同じようなよ。
In places where you can't make any money, you can't get your hands on all kinds of things that a millionaire would have, cars and TVs and things. Of course, people see this and they want it. It sounds funny for me to say this, but I wish they'd do me a favor and not sell that stuff to farmers.
だから百姓さんはよ、東北の農家さんは、そういうものを売んねえようにしてくれって言うんだよな。
So even if we wanted to buy it, we couldn't, you know?
I want to hold my wife tight at night. That's why I got married. I just want to live like a normal man and wife, you know? So in the summer, I go off and work as hard as I can to save up. Otherwise, you can't get any money. You can't get any money.
In the late 1960s, Japan's post-war baby boom generation was just entering college. It was a time of instability, as Japanese students joined young people around the globe in revolt against the world their parents had built. The United States was mired in the Vietnam conflict. Meanwhile, Japan's economic growth continued apace. By 1969, Japan's exports were booming, not only in the light manufacturing sectors, but in shipbuilding, television, electronics, and photo equipment. the world found itself the recipient of a torrent of goods labeled Made in Japan. The globe's other great trading nations began to bristle from Japan's evident success. Trade friction was beginning to develop, particularly in the area of textiles. The Japanese island of Okinawa remained occupied by the United States. Prime Minister Eisaku Sato placed the return of Okinawa high on his diplomatic agenda. Washington was willing to return Okinawa to Japanese control in return for a compromise on trade issues.
I know that until Okinawa has been restored to its native land, the post-war period will not be over for Japan.
Sato visited Richard Nixon's White House in 1969. Nixon hoped to move toward a more balanced trade relationship with Japan. In particular, he wanted Japan to cut back its export of synthetic fibers. In Japanese, nawa means rope, and the negotiations between Nixon and Sato became known as the Thread for Ropes talks, trading sovereignty over Okinawa, the rope, for concessions on textiles, the thread. Okinawa was returned, and Sato became the first post-war prime minister to set foot on the island. The textile issue, however, remained unresolved. In 1970, Osaka hosted the World's Fair.
Lavish opening ceremonies are attended by some 7,000 people, which reflect Japan's remarkable development from the ruins of war 25 years ago. The colorful parade of children from many nations in their native costumes is a tribute to the progress and harmony of the human race.
Japanese exports to the United States continue to climb. In 1970 alone, auto exports rose 50%, as 400,000 Japanese cars were shipped to the United States. Textile exports also steadily increased. The result was a Japanese trade surplus with the United States of $380 million. Meanwhile, the United States experienced negative growth, as its gross national product dropped for the first time in 12 years. 5 million Americans were unemployed, and long lines formed wherever work was offered. In August 1971, President Nixon suspended convertibility of the U.S. dollar into gold and placed a 10% surcharge on all imports into the American market.
Time has come for a new economic policy for the United States. Its targets are unemployment, inflation, and international speculation. And this is how we are going to attack those targets. First, on the subject of jobs. We all know why we have an unemployment problem. 2 million workers have been released from the armed forces and defense plants because of our success in winding down the war in Vietnam.
The era of fixed exchange rates was coming to an end. By December, the Japanese currency had been revalued upward from 360 to 308 yen to the dollar, sending ripples of shock throughout the Japanese economy.
There's still lots and lots of land in Japan. And if we can get to it by bullet train, or by freeways, or by airplanes, then there's no great problem. Spending all day inside a building, from morning to night in a matchbox, that's no way to live. Think about how nice it would be to live with some trees around. And that's where the plan for remodeling the Japanese archipelago comes in.
Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka's plan for remodeling the Japanese archipelago was advocated as a way both to alleviate the congestion of the cities and to help speed development of the countryside. His policies resulted in rampant land speculation and wild inflation. War broke out in the Middle East in October 1973. OPEC quadrupled the price of oil. Japan, which has virtually no petroleum reserves of its own, was particularly hard hit.
The frenzy over the shortage of such daily items as toilet paper has now spread to the Kanto region. At opening time in supermarkets in Tokyo, long lines of customers stampede for sugar and toilet paper. Such goods are quickly sold out, and groups of housewives unable to buy any surround store managers, accusing them of holding back supplies in hopes that prices will rise.
We must change our thinking, accept the limits of resources, and adopt a code of values in which conservation is the rule.
Japan had been characterized as an island floating on a sea of oil. Political leaders grappled with the fact that the oil that had fueled Japan's post-war recovery bore a political as well as an economic price. A special envoy was dispatched to visit the oil kingdoms in order to try to assure a steady supply of oil in the future. Domestically, a national consensus was reached on the importance of energy conservation, with long-lasting effect on the Japanese economy. People from all walks of life took extreme measures to cut back and conserve energy.
That was 30 seconds. So how much gas did you save?
We saved about 15 cubic centimeters. That would be about 1 yen at the gas pumps.
How much did you save all day today?
This much.
In the good old days, we used to think that we couldn't make anything without energy, but we've worked hard to conserve it. So now Japan is the world leader in the technology for energy conservation. In steel manufacturing today, we don't use 1 drop of oil. If we hadn't had the oil crisis, we would not have developed that technology by now. And conservation is being carried out by individual initiative, on the spot. The employees realize that if they didn't control the problem themselves, the company could go under. And I think that's wonderful.
In 1970, the American Congress passed a strict auto emission standards bill in order to decrease carbon monoxide pollution. Auto manufacturers around the world scrambled to meet the requirements of the so-called Muskie Bill. Most automakers sought to meet the standards by treating engine exhaust. Honda, however, took the more ambitious route of trying to design a cleaner, more efficient engine.
We succeeded with that one. I said that it should be easy for us to eliminate carbon monoxide because we'd had a lot of experiences with that. If we just put the experience to use, then we could be the first in the world to meet the standards of the Muskie Bill. So I got everybody together and we agreed to do our best on it because we knew we had the potential to do it. I encouraged them because we had so much experience with race cars.
The result was the CVCC engine, the world's first low-pollution automobile motor. It was a great success for Honda and helped spur the company's exports even higher. One important response to the oil crisis throughout Japanese industries was the widespread adoption of integrated circuits, or ICs. These helped improve industrial efficiency across Japan. The phrase, "use ICs to automate," and "we will overcome the oil crisis," became the watchword among corporate managers. Oil could no longer be used and wasted without dire consequences for the nation. Computers were introduced into the workplace. Robots began to replace human labor, and Japan emerged from the oil crisis an even stronger competitor in the world economy. OPEC's second oil price hike in 1979 again slowed Japan's economic growth and drove prices up. But by this time, Japan had developed a range of countermeasures against rising energy costs, and the recovery was relatively quick. Japan's recovery was noted throughout the world, and by the 1980s, American analysts were searching for the key to Japan's economic comeback. A report to the President of the United States pointed out that while U.S. productivity had risen only 1.2% between 1960 and 1983, Japanese productivity had increased 5.9% over the same period. In the field of industrial robots, Japan far outstripped other countries. Japanese manufacturers have adopted 25 robots for every 10,000 workers, a ratio 5 times that of the United States and West Germany. And Japan continues to lead in the number of engineering graduates expressed as a percentage of its population. The United States threatened to retaliate against what it saw as unfair trading practices in an effort to shrink a trade deficit that exceeded $50 billion in 1986.
To me, that says that $50 billion has to shift back toward 40, 30, 20, hopefully in a gradual and orderly way, which will ease some of the pressures that you're talking about, adjustment pressures on the part of the Japanese firms.
The value of the Japanese yen rose 50% against the U.S. dollar in 1986, from 260 yen to 150 yen to the dollar. This high yen shock is the latest economic crisis to befall the Japanese economy. Major sectors of the economy, such as shipbuilding and steelmaking, were already in decline before the high yen crisis. Now their futures are unclear. Unemployment has emerged as a political issue for the first time in decades, as industries are forced to close down operations and temporarily lay off employees. In April of 1986, the Maekawa Committee, headed by the former governor of the Bank of Japan, called on the government to set a national goal of reducing Japan's massive balance of payments surplus. One month later, in May 1986, Japan received the leaders of the industrial world at the Tokyo Economic Summit to discuss such issues as the expansion of Japan's domestic demand, the improvement of foreign access to the Japanese market, liberalization of Japanese financial markets, international cooperation to solve problems like the third world debt crisis, and exchange rate stabilization.
Japanese industry now faces a difficult period. I have tried very hard to explain this to the other world leaders at the summit.
From the ashes of economic ruin, Japan has emerged as a major economic force. Today, Japan is seeking to balance its interests with those of the rest of the world. Japanese industries now face new challenges. Their response would dictate the direction of Japanese economic life for the next generation, to whom war and privation are history, not memory, and whose dedication to continued national economic growth is as yet untested.